how did you find out over the weekend that you were dead? You see that?
No.
People didn't see you for a couple days. 1.3 million user engagements as of Saturday morning about your demise.
Really?
I didn't see that.
You know, I have heard, it's sort of crazy, but last week I did numerous news conferences, all successful. They went very well, like this is going very well. And then I didn't do any for 2 days, and they said, there must be something wrong with him.
That was Donald Trump explaining that he's not dead and that he didn't know he was dead. Although when we get to our focus later in the show, what we are going to talk about a little bit is why he said that, because apparently he had heard about all the rumors. But you are at the Political Junkie podcast, and this episode is not dead yet. I'm Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil Young.
And we're here to talk about dead presidents, but first the news. The hottest thing, at least on my mind, Neil, is the shellacking that Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. took from the Senate Finance Committee yesterday, including from members of his own party. A major point of contention was whether the department, under Kennedy's direction, had or had not limited access to the COVID vaccine, and whether he had lied in his confirmation hearings. Neil, did you get to watch any of this?
I saw a few clips online as it was going viral yesterday. You probably know this about me, Claire, but I don't like confrontation. So the clips made me super uncomfortable because they were so, of a confrontational nature, which is fantastic. He should be on the hot seat. And it's nice seeing that there was a sort of bipartisan aspect to that in at least a couple of examples. But, it was like really satisfying to see like Senator Cassidy, for example, giving Kennedy a hard time, and him just sort of being his Weasley self.
Yeah, and of course that's Senator Bill Cassidy, who is a doctor from Tennessee, who is chair of the committee and who in the confirmation hearings at least presented himself as a skeptic that Kennedy would make a good secretary, and sort of forced him into the position of saying what he would not do, which is keep people from vaccines. As it turns out, Bill Cassidy is one of the two doctors on the committee, and he's the doctor who actually believes in vaccination. Now, Kennedy kept saying over and over again that what he was doing was not keeping vaccines from people, but that's not true, right, Neil?
It's not true. And literally right before we got on here, I got a text from a friend here in Los Angeles who is at Walgreens trying to get a COVID vaccine and said that Walgreens was giving, or whatever the drugstore was giving them a hard time. So even here in California, there's already difficulty with access to this, and it's only going to get worse. And so, yes, he's not been truthful here. And, we could also maybe fold into this conversation the news out of Florida and the decision by the Attorney General there. I believe it's the Attorney General there who's made the decision that the state will no longer have vaccine mandates.
Right.
So lots of stuff is happening on public health. And I guess my bigger question here is like, what are the limits of this politics? Because I think that you see with Republican senators, giving Kennedy a hard time yesterday. And what I'm hearing anecdotally from friends and family back home in Florida, a lot of people who are Republicans, a lot of people who are supporters of Trump do not like these sorts of policies and feel like this is an infringement on their own, medical lives and their own health.
Right. Well, and let's be clear with our audience. The reason that Kennedy's actions will prevent people from getting vaccines is twofold. One is if HHS does not recommend them, and I believe it's the CDC actually, which is a subset of HHS, if they do not recommend them, insurance companies don't have to pay for them. So that means people could be on the hook for $200, $250 for a vaccine, which is the best way to get people not to do it. The other thing is the requirement that people get a prescription from their doctor.
Yeah.
And of course, great many people do not have primary care physicians. I mean, even in the state of Massachusetts, which is a very liberal state, especially in Massachusetts, I would say, in my part of the state, if you get a primary care physician, you're considered lucky. People are on lists for years trying to get into people's practices. So that is an effective limitation. But I would also like to say that my governor, Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey, who I adore, also a lesbian.
So here's what we're doing. First of all, this is something that no state has yet done. Insurance plans in Massachusetts will continue to cover the vaccines recommended by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, regardless of what any other federal agency or appointee says. This requirement has now been formalized in a joint bulletin issued by the State Division of Insurance and the Department of Public Health. It will cover the full range of recommended vaccines, including flu, COVID, as well as children's vaccines like measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, and more.
I think this really underlines how important, as we're fighting for things like public health and education and so on, how important governors are.
Yeah, and just building on that, I was looking at my phone because there was the news yesterday of the launch of what's being called the West Coast Health Alliance, which is Hawaii, California, Oregon, and Washington are joining in some sort of joint commitment to safeguarding public health. And I think there's also been talk about that, or maybe it's also been in the works with some handful of East Coast states as well. But I think there's going to be all sorts of ways that blue states bind together and find, alliances and coalitions, and even these sort of joint state commitments to all sorts of different things. But public health might be one of them, and certainly governors are going to be important here.
I think that's absolutely right. And in that vein, and then we'll move on to our next news item, you probably did not see Marsha Blackburn, who is also on the Finance Committee, who I think is just one of the stupidest people alive. She is leaving the Senate to run for governor of Tennessee.
And we'll win, right, in a landslide.
And we'll win. But here's the thing. She could not speak without reading it off a card. And everybody else was taking a look at their notes and then speaking extemporaneously. Even Kennedy was speaking extemporaneously. And of course, when he does that, you can't understand a word he says. It's just total word salad.
Yeah.
But Marsha Blackburn was just reading her questions and her statements off a card. And I kind of thought, if you can't function in a committee meeting without a script, how exactly do you plan to run the state of Tennessee?
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole segment on Blackburn. She does have a past as a television reporter, right, or a television news anchor. So,
hence the need for a script.
Absolutely, but it's one thing to sort of bloviate as a senator. It's another thing to actually be an executive role, running a large state. Best of luck to them.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's go on to our next news item. We are expecting an announcement this week that Iowa Senator Joni "We're All Going to Die" Ernst is stepping aside in 2026. This makes 6 Republicans and 4 Democrats who are vacating the premises. Then there is Maine Governor Janet Mills, who may challenge Republican Senator Susan Collins for her seat. Mixed feelings about that one, but Janet Mills is, of course, a baller, and she would do a great job in the Senate. Democrats need 4 pickups to take that body. Neil, this is beginning to feel like a snow globe full of senators that someone is shaking, and it's not altogether clear how it's going to pan out next year. What do you think?
There's a lot of numbers in the mix here, and I think there's going to be a ton of focus on the Senate, particularly if the House, because of the shenanigans of Republicans, to get themselves a lead there via gerrymandering. The Senate is a place that maybe is more in play than it would have looked like a little bit ago. But it's also, I think what's going to be interesting is what happens in the case of the Republican retirements and the sort of folks who come forward, because I think most of these folks we would describe as moderate, maybe not moderate in the normal times of American politics, but that aren't the Trumpiest of the Trumpy, although,
Right.
Blackburn is one of the ones retiring, and she certainly is. But yeah, it'll be
Yeah.
interesting to see. There's a lot to watch in the next year, and anything it seems like could happen between now and then. But I also think there's a question if anyone more says that
Right.
they're not running again.
Right. And it's a very unstable political environment. I've also noticed, for example, that Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who
Yeah.
is also not running again, has actually kind of been out there pushing back against Trump. There's also something else going on there, which is not in our news summary, but I just want to toss it in, which is the number of Republicans, including, for Christ's sake, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are jumping in on the Epstein thing
Yep.
and standing with the victims. And it sort of seems like there is the beginning, both in the Kennedy hearings and with the Epstein stuff, of a gentle but persistent pushback against Donald Trump. Do you think that's real, or am I just being my typical Sally Sunshine self?
Well, I mean, I think it's real in the sense that they are deviating from, White House
Yep.
strategy and talking points on a lot of these, or at least two
Yep.
of these things. And given the lockstep that Republicans have been in the last decade because of the full collapse into Trumpism, I think any of these moments of distinction between Trump and the White House and what other Republicans are saying is notable. The
Yep.
bigger question is, like, what does it amount to? Is it just sort of temporary moments of like difference, or is it indicative of like maybe a bigger development taking
Right.
hold?
Right. Well, meanwhile, our next news item, faithful podcast listeners will recall that we did an episode on Laura Loomer a few weeks ago, which was actually one of our most popular episodes. You'll be glad to know, Neil. Well, it looks like someone else is getting Loomered. Virginia Senator Mark Warner, the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, was scheduled to visit the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency at its headquarters in his own state. The visit was canceled when right-wing influencer Laura Loomer accused him repeatedly and without foundation of being a Russian asset and said he should be tried for treason. The visit was classified, so it's unclear how Laura Loomer knew about it because she does not, in fact, have a security clearance. Neil.
I mean, she just gets to say whatever she wants, right? And not only does she get to do that, then it actually has real world implications. At least it seems to move the dial with Trump and other key Republicans. I think the question of how she knew about this meeting is enormous. It feels like it should be front page, like top headline type thing. But also, we live in a moment in which it's barely a ripple in the media universe. It's certainly scary, and I think the sort of accusation of Russian asset is interesting. Like, that seems like what's happening there with that accusation? Is this about diversion? Is it about a sort of confession of Trump folks that they actually are, and this is a way of just moving the ball? I mean, what do you think that's about?
I think it's about Warner's participation in the January 6th investigation and his continuing probes into the role of Russians in Donald Trump's political life. Warner has used his post on the Intelligence Committee to continually revive the notion that Trump is supported by the Russians, that the White House is vulnerable to Russian influence. So I think actually it is a question of MAGA striking back. One of their themes is that everything that was said about the connections between Donald Trump and Russia is a hoax. Well, you may believe some things, you may believe other things. You don't have to believe there was a P-tape to know that Donald Trump wanted to build in Russia. You don't have to believe in the Steele dossier to know that Donald Trump was looking for money in all the wrong places because he could no longer get a bank loan. So there are clear connections there, and actually it has been proven that Russian intelligence did interfere in the 2016 election. They didn't change votes, they didn't get into the voting machines, but they did, in fact, spread all sorts of disinformation and propaganda via Facebook and other platforms. And there's no reason to think that that has stopped. I mean, those bot farms still exist.
Yeah.
So I think it's Laura Loomer being Laura Loomer. And when she sees something that sort of triggers a MAGA outrage, button, then she jumps on it. And I think if you are Laura Loomer, you actually have to keep doing things that put you in the news in order to retain your influence in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, that's her job. So
yeah, that is her job. Okay, so final news item we're going to touch on this week is that the New York Post scooped the media world on Thursday when the Murdoch-owned tabloid announced that Paramount was in talks to buy Bari Weiss's Free Press for a possible $200 million and put Weiss in a senior editorial role at CBS. Now, since then, I think that has happened, Neil. I think they've actually signed on the dotted line, and Bari Weiss has gone from being someone who had to read terrible things about her in the New York Times Slack channel to being a multimillionaire who has gone from Substack to a major media corporation. On the one hand, Neil, this makes me think there's a future for you and me, maybe not at CBS, but somewhere else, which wants a cute gay couple talking about politics. But what do we think? How did Bari Weiss jump to the top of the heap like this?
Well, I'm very curious about the valuation on the Free Press and the $200 million deal. I mean, on one hand, you'd assume like that has to be merited by the subscription base or whatever.
Right.
But considering that this is part of the whole Paramount, takeover of CBS, and
right.
It does feel like, isn't this potentially a valuation that's more sort of politically influenced than actually
Yes.
economically so?
Yes.
This is part of just the political message that this media organization is sending to the administration. I also think it's a bit interesting that Bari Weiss, who made her career and her rise to sort of fame and influence on snubbing traditional media, and being that, her whole critique was that those places no longer serve the public good, and that they silenced voices, and that she was
Right.
going to create this other space in which heterodoxy could flourish,
Right.
and free exchange of ideas and all that, even though it just happens to look like another conservative rag, that ultimately she's going to be running CBS News. I mean, it
Right.
feels like maybe the point wasn't so much the critique of media as just a career move on her part, which,
Right.
good for her. But
Right.
I do think sort of returning to the ideology here that's sort of driven her, or the ideology she's professed,
Right.
is worth revisiting when she's back in the leadership of, a traditional media space.
Right. Well, this certainly does seem very grafty on a certain level. And I agree
Yeah.
with you about the valuation. I mean, I've seen valuations of the Free Press that say $80 million maybe, but not $200 million. Okay, so listeners, if you don't know this, CBS is owned by Paramount, and Paramount was sold to a company called Skydance by Sherry Redstone, who inherited it from her father. And, honestly, I blame Sherry Redstone for this, because she let those negotiations with Skydance go on for about 18 months because she wanted more money than her company was worth. And ultimately, she had to pay out. But she also, because of the CBS settlement with the Trump administration over the 60 Minutes interview of Kamala Harris, we don't know what else was in that deal. I think there was something in there about, getting rid of DEI, because there always is, but that they had to have, a more balanced political coverage, and that they promised to put in an ombudsperson to make that happen. It sounds to me like Bari Weiss is that person. Although they have not called her an ombuds, which sounds, of course, like you work for HR, which you do. But I think that's their solution, is to bring in a property that is, obviously valuable.
Yeah.
But let me just say, I mean, I used to subscribe to the Free Press, and I did it because it seemed like there was something happening there that I needed to understand. And I finally had to stop. And I think what the Free Press does is going to be very, very dangerous for CBS and would be dangerous for any news operation, which is it reduces everything political to a whole set of personal feelings. And there are things like, I used to be a corporate lawyer, and then I learned that feeding my children farm fresh eggs was the most satisfying thing I could do. I mean, I'm
Completely.
exaggerating, but they're actually like that,
Yeah.
And so, and it totally then pushes the audience away from ideas like, hey, what if there were childcare on site? What if we could actually get healthy food? It's all personal, and it's all about personal choices and using your power to remake your life.
Yeah.
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 So anyway, all right. Well, we'll see how that works out. Could be a future episode, Neil. So let's turn to our main focus, which is the question of Donald Trump's health. Over Labor Day weekend, and even from a few days before Labor Day, that last news week in August, no matter what you do, is always dead. But social media was suddenly abuzz with rumors that Donald Trump was either dead or dying, and that the White House was covering it up. Now, Neil, this isn't the first speculation we've seen about Donald Trump's health, is it?
No, there's been many, and they seem to be sort of growing in frequency in recent months.
Yeah.
I think in large part because he doesn't look well or sound well, and also because I think many Americans don't wish him well. So any sort of clue or sign, I think, is being interpreted like,
Right.
Is it a bruise on his hand? Is it, his inability to put a sentence together? Is it him leaning forward, and all the rest? Inspires lots of online speculation about his health.
Right. And of course, those of us who are old enough to have elderly parents are also happily diagnosing him too. I mean, I put the hand bruise together with the swollen ankles and
Right.
thought, oh, congestive heart failure. I mean, my mother and all of her friends are on some kind of blood thinner. And actually, when your heart is not working properly, you begin to get swollen ankles or some kind of, venous involvement. I'm not a doctor, but I do play one on TV. Now, Trump, and, just thinking back to the clip we started with, Trump said he wasn't aware of the rumors, but he actually was, wasn't he?
He was, and he sort of says it in his response. Like, he
Right.
pretends like he doesn't know what they're talking about. And then at some point he says something along the lines of, oh, and then 2 days of me not giving a press conference, everyone starts talking to me about me being dead. So
Right.
of course he's aware. I mean, this is the most online person in the country.
Right.
And it was the only thing that was trending for a couple days, at least in my algorithm, and I imagine in his as well. He's probably looking for stories about himself. Yes, he was very much aware of this. And none of this really answers the question of where was he all that time? I mean,
Right.
he didn't speak for several days, and he made some sort of comment about, well, when Biden didn't have press conference for months at a time and no one speculated about his health. Well, that's not true. People were speculating all the time
Right.
about Biden's health. And also the point is not to compare his frequency of appearance to Biden's, but to say that Trump is hyper online, hyper visible. And so when he's not those things for a couple of days, it likely raises questions.
Right. And of course, one of the things we know was that there was nothing on his schedule.
Right.
Okay. So that is one of the things that started the rumors. Why is there nothing on his schedule? And had the White House merely said, the president is taking 5 days to rest at one of his golf clubs or something like that. Now, what I think is tricky, and I think what you're saying about him being the most online person, and that he backs that up by trying to be the most visible person, right? I mean, he's always doing things to get attention, and all of a sudden this attention-getting man is totally invisible. But I think the other piece of it is that past White Houses were very transparent about what presidents did. And you could actually see a White House schedule and see who the president was meeting with, when, how long, so on and so forth. Trump's schedules, even in the first administration, had things like Trump is at his desk by 10 o'clock, and then there's a big blank space. And then there were periodic things called executive time, in which actually what we learned is that it was just downtime. It was just time for him to take a nap or watch television or something like that. But I think the unconventional quality of this White House has, in a way, kind of tripped them up, because that is how you manage information about presidents, is by giving out information about presidents, even if it's not entirely transparent, right?
Yes, absolutely. And also, we should add to this, the one event that he did have over that period that was finally put on the schedule was a golf outing over, I think it was on the Saturday.
Right.
And then when he went to golf, there was only like this brief moment of him being seen getting into a car from a distance, not taking any questions, not speaking, not looking well. And then, and I don't know if it was the White House that did it, but certainly White House adjacent, Trump friendly media outlets and media, channels on Twitter and the like were posting pictures of him golfing and being with other golfers. And those pictures were quickly proven to have been taken months ago. Right. So there's sort of sharing information to help be transparent and help actually shape the media narrative. Right. They don't do that to begin with. But then on top of that is, falsifying documents or putting things out that is supposed to be pictures of him that day that we know from 6 months ago. That doesn't inspire confidence and certainly adds to the questions.
It does not inspire confidence. And, one of the things I was thinking about today as I was paddling around in the ocean off Martha's Vineyard is that the capacity to have this conversation has been changed by social media.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the stuff that I was seeing online when I clicked on hashtag is Trump dead, were photographs of him that were really blown up with something circled, and then someone saying, what is that lump on his head? Or his face seems very full, or, people making all sorts of judgments about his appearance from fiddling with the photographs. I suspect a lot of those people were trolls, and people just, engagement trolls, I think they're called. But it's also the case that after 2006, presidents kind of lost control of their images in a whole new way, right, Neil?
Yeah, and I think, listen, the Trump team, and we've also talked about Gavin Newsom, there's a lot to be said about the power of, powerful people and institutions to still shape media narratives and public attitudes and public perception. And also that is limited, or it's shaped, or it operates in a completely different context than presidents did, not that very long ago, when really they had almost, monopoly on public attitude, or not public attitudes, but public perceptions about their lives and their leadership. And so I also think it's a moment in which all of us can be a little bit mindful of our own vulnerabilities when we look at these things. I mean, I think I was overly trustworthy of a lot of the accounts and a lot of the messages that were suggesting Trump was in serious decline. I mean, I spent a long time looking at that picture of his forehead and the bump there. And you're right to remind us that we don't know how trustworthy that image is and what the sort of verification of that image is to begin with. And so, I think a lot of us like to think that the other side is the conspiratorial one, is, prone to fake news and all the rest. But I think it's not so much about us individually, although it's partly that. It's about this completely Wild West environment that we live in the media.
Yeah, and this idea that anything that's posted online is some form of news.
Exactly.
or is contributing to or speaking to a news cycle that we have to take seriously. And, just going back to something you said earlier, Neil, we've been commenting on Trump's health for a long time. And part of that is he lies about it.
Right.
There was that moment when he sent people to raid his doctor's office to get all of his files from his primary care physician in New York, which the doctor, who sounded like sort of like a jerk, but he said, all they had to do was call me and ask. It's like this man I've known for years. He sends a bunch of thugs to take his files away. So Trump is very, very secretive. He sent one of his lawyers sent a letter to the University of Pennsylvania warning them from ever revealing his grades. Same thing to the military academy he attended upstate. But the lies about his height, the lies about his weight, the fact that all of us know that you cannot eat fast food all the time and be healthy. This is axiomatic. So all of that lying then creates an atmosphere which it's very hard for Trump's people to reassure the public, even of the most outrageous rumors.
Yeah, and I think, JD Vance, I don't know if he said this or tweeted this or both, but something along the lines of, a media who spent 5 days telling us that Trump was dead. I'm paraphrasing here. A media that spent 5 days telling us that Trump is dead. Maybe we shouldn't trust them on anything else they say.
Right.
Well, first of all, media wasn't real. Media not in its traditional format wasn't telling us that.
Right.
So that's not accurate to begin with. But again, this is a person that we're talking about who will not be truthful about his height or his weight.
Right.
And that's sort of the foundation upon which like a whole host of lies are created. So it's not surprising that people are skeptical about anything having to do with this man's health. But the ability for them to spin it and turn it around, that this is some sort of media, a sign of media obsession and media liberalism and all the rest, is obviously what conservatives are going to do, and certainly Trump conservatives are going to do. But I don't think we're going to get any closer to the truth on any of this anytime soon.
Right. I don't think we are either. And, it's interesting. I read Chris Christie's memoir that he published right before he ran for president again in 2020. 2024. Excuse me. He was in the primary season. And one of the things he talked about in his memoir is that he and Trump were friends for a while. And Trump came to him at one point and said, dude, if you're ever going to run for higher office, you have to get the stomach band surgery because you're too fat. And so for Trump, being fat is not actually about health. It's about how people perceive you. And so by telling these lies, he thinks he can shape those perceptions. But, there have also been more serious accusations, Neil, that in the first Trump administration, that there was speed, Xanax, other kinds of narcotics that were easily available in the White House, that Ronnie Jackson, the president's personal physician, who's now a congressperson from Texas, would write people a prescription for almost anything. And then there was ongoing scrutiny of Trump's potential drug use, including several debates where he sniffed nonstop.
Yeah.
Now maybe he just had a cold, but there's been a lot of talk about Trump on medication for ADHD and maybe abusing that a little bit.
And there's the photo of him in his office in the first administration, where there was a drawer in the desk that was open, and there were just like piles and piles of, I can't remember what it was that people identified with, but something that one shouldn't have like stockpiled in that number. In terms of the lying and the sort of public image and the weight and stuff, ultimately, Trump is lying in order to lie to himself. He's telling himself that he's whatever the weight is and the height is. He's telling himself that he's the smartest person in the world and the only person that can do things. We just all lived with the consequence of that, of his own ability to be truthful with himself. we are all living in a world that he's making because of his own inability to be honest and truthful with himself. But like, this is a man who's obsessed with weight and also eats McDonald's constantly. Like, there's just an inherent self-contradiction there that I think drives the dissembling.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's very interesting because, J.D. Vance has actually lost a lot of weight.
Yes.
Since he first ran for Senate. He actually looks kind of trim and nice now. He was very pudgy before, as people often are when they have desk jobs. So, no fat phobia here. But he clearly decided that in order to be vice president and possibly have a step up to the presidency, he needed to project a different image. Trump doesn't seem to care about that. Now, I want to shift the ground a little bit to talk about what makes these conspiracies possible, because right-wing conspiracists often have difficulty knowing whether political celebrities are dead or alive or sick or well. There is a long-standing rumor stoked by QAnon that JFK Jr. is alive and that he's going to appear sometime. Maybe he's going to join the Trump administration. The 2016 Trump campaign stoked conspiracies that Hillary Clinton was ill, and obviously Republicans hammered on Joe Biden's health non-stop. So does this create an atmosphere within which Trump can say pretty much whatever he wants about himself and it can't be proven or disproven?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, especially when so much of the politics that fuels Trump's support is a distrust in media, distrust in sort of expertise and authority. I just think it positions them perfectly to say, well, that's not true. That's not accurate. Here I'm alive and well. I'm speaking to you right now. Clearly the media, it lies to you about everything. But I think there's this other interesting question of like, why does this sort of particular question around like being alive or being dead or the status of people's health seem to animate this set of politics more than another one? I mean, is it just sort of a particular psychology that's more geared toward conspiracism, and there's nothing more conspiratorial about whether a person purported to be dead is actually alive? Or is it something different? I mean, it's weird to be sort of obsessed with whether or not JFK Jr. is like what's he been doing? Like hiding out in Hyannisport for 30 years?
Right, exactly. Well, and I would also say that there were assertions that Biden was actually dead. I mean, do you remember the rumors on the right that there were actually actors playing Joe Biden in the White House and that Joe Biden was actually either ill or dead? So this is an ongoing theme on the conspiratorial right. That being said, there is a history of presidents and their staffs deceiving Americans about health. But I want to start with one president who actually didn't, which is Dwight Eisenhower. In 1955, Dwight Eisenhower made the unusual decision to go public with the fact that he had had a heart attack. 2 years later, he actually had a stroke, but he almost did not run again in 1956 because of that heart attack. That being said, going public with heart disease, he is credited with heart disease coming into the national public conversation and people actually taking heart disease seriously. So he actually gets a lot of praise for having struggled with his health issues in public, right, Neil?
Yeah, and what a historical point of contrast to have a person a president who, when at the time this was not considered at all what one did was to come forward and to say that, and for the doctor who treated him, who was like a leading expert on heart disease, to become a sort of national celebrity for a moment and to, tour the country and to inform Americans about what heart disease looked like, and that people really changed their awareness and their habits in ways that really impacted cardiological health in this country. And now we have this guy who's putting RFK Jr. in charge of public health and all the rest, and sowing just sort of the seeds of like vaccine skepticism and on and on. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously a very different president in Eisenhower. What else would we say about just the history of this across the 20th century?
Well, I think we could talk about Woodrow Wilson having had a stroke while in office, and many people believe that his wife Edith was running the government until his term ended in 1920. So there's Edith Wilson. There's the Edith Wilson thing. There is the question of whether Mr. Teapot Dome. Why am I blanking on my favorite dead president?
Harding.
All right, Harding. Thank you very much. There is
I was
some
also
question.
doing my
having
my own brain farts.
So there's some question about how President Warren Harding died, although he probably did die of congestive heart failure. But there were rumors long afterwards that his wife had poisoned him, and that there had been something nefarious at work, that he might have killed himself because of the emerging Teapot Dome scandal. Then there is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was disabled from polio. But the Roosevelt example is kind of instructive about our changing media, right, Neil?
Yeah, because I mean, he lived in a time in which, radio was the way that he connected with most Americans, and so his sort of body wasn't visible in a way that later Americans would be captured on television all the time.
Right.
And I think that just you could put Eisenhower's medical event and the announcement about it, you could sort of suggest that that's a turning point in this history in the 20th century. Right. But then you come to the 1980s and we have Ronald Reagan. And it's pretty clear that he was undergoing at least the early stages of Alzheimer's in the last couple of years of his presidency. And that was very much kept under wraps by that White House. And so it's not necessarily like a sort of clear line of progression here that Eisenhower marks this clear turning point, as I think these are really different scenarios and different conditions in different political moments, and by obviously very different political actors that shape the choices that are made.
Well, and I think Reagan's a very good example for two reasons. One is that he was very conscious of his image, having been a Hollywood actor, and of how he staged his presidency, literally. And part of that staging was to appear incredibly vigorous. I mean, he was a very fit man, but he was always seen on horseback. His suits were very well tailored to show off a very well preserved body. He was a handsome guy, and so on. And he is kind of drawing on another president, which is John F. Kennedy, who also projected vigor, but actually was a very sick man for the 3 years he was president, right?
Yes. And, just about Reagan, don't you think that Nancy Reagan was also a big part of that? I mean, she was a big part of every decision in that White House.
Yeah.
But I think that, we know how much Nancy Reagan was just absolutely gaga over her husband, and also was a shrewd political actor, and shaped a lot of White House strategy around Reagan's public image and the way he presented himself. But it also seems like wasn't willing to acknowledge the health status of her own husband. That there was a lot of denialism there. And I think that I'm sort of psychologizing here, but I do think the sort of power of that denialism seems like it might have shaped the Reagan White House or the Reagan administration and what it made known. And I also think that, again, it sort of ties into Trump and his own, fantastical ways of thinking about himself. I mean, no one really wants to confront their mortality, and it can't feel great to have the internet speculating about how much longer you have to live. But also there are real implications for that when you're the leader of the free world.
Right. Well, and also I would say, if you don't want people to speculate on your health, don't be president now, because that is clearly the state of play on social media. I would also say, you're bringing up some really interesting points about Reagan. And of course, Reagan had people around him who were really good at government. Yes. Trump doesn't. And still, even with those people around him and with Nancy Reagan policing everything and everyone that went in and out of the West Wing, Iran-Contra happened. And many historians believe that Iran-Contra happened because some folks came into Reagan and said, hey, how about we try this? And he had no idea what they were talking about or didn't hear them. And he approved it without actually knowing what was going to happen next. Now, maybe that's false, but a lot of the evidence seems to be pointing in that direction. And that people who wanted to do a kind of daring foreign policy move took advantage of the fact that the president was not able to make a decision. Of course, we're used to that with the Trump White House because he makes terrible decisions all the time. But I think the question of the chaos that Donald Trump cultivates around him makes the question of his health much more worrisome than it would otherwise be. But let me sort of springboard off that, Neil, and ask you, why do you think the public needs to know about the president's health?
Well, it's a good question. It seems like the automatic answer to that should be yes, of course. But then when you look at the long history that we've just talked about, I mean, to know about the president's health to, I think, the degree and the detail that we assume should be a given,
right.
That's a very recent historical development.
Right.
So could the case be made that actually history shows us that Americans don't necessarily need to know this? It doesn't really impact their lives or the country. Or is it that, no, that was a relic of an age in which we had a completely different relationship to the executive branch when the federal government operated in a different way, and given, the challenges of our modern era, this is vital for national security and public safety and public trust and leadership. I think I would be inclined to say that that a time of like real diminishing public trust in institutions, it doesn't seem to me like keeping this information secret or hidden is a way in which to build that trust.
Right. Well, and of course, we're also in a period in which there is a constant drumbeat in both parties, but more so in the Democratic Party, about an aging political establishment.
Yeah.
So, and it seems like some Democrats are trying to say this is an issue. We saw last week that Gerald Nadler announced that he would not run in 2026. This was actually after he endorsed New York mayoral candidate Zoran Mondani. But Nadler is 78. Now, in the scale of things, he seems not old yet. But then when we think 78, that is at least a decade after which most people retire.
Yeah, and it really is stunning how long so many of our politicians go into running again for office at ages where you think you should be like 10 years into your very developed golf game at the retirement home. And I don't know, I've always sort of bristled at notions of both term limits and of age limits. I have something sort of instinctively that doesn't like that, because I feel like, well, it should be a case by case basis, and people, are living longer lives than they ever have. And age shouldn't be a determinant of, one's ability to do one's job. But I do wonder if public attitudes about that are really going to shift, and we actually might see some changes around this. I mean, you could imagine, I think, changes around age, or there could be changes around age limits. Maybe those are more viable than term limits. I don't know, but we'll see.
Well, I think it's very interesting what you're saying. And I was thinking that, of course, both you and I come from an academic world where people frequently work into their 80s and even their 90s.
Yes.
And often people who, sit in distinguished chairs and make lots and lots of money. And there isn't much incentive to stop working when you're a much older academic, because there isn't a whole lot of scrutiny of what you're actually doing. And some people are doing a terrific job, and some people, as we know, are not doing a terrific job. So it's something I think about a great deal in politics, because I exactly know that if you have enough people working for you, if you have enough teaching assistants and enough research assistants, and you don't come to the office that much, it is really possible to appear to be doing a job that you're not doing. That said, watching Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders yesterday in that finance committee meeting, I was like, okay, some old people should leave, not all of them. So, Neil, the president went viral for not being dead last week. What do you and I want to go viral this week?
I want to talk about this thing, and I'm very curious if you know about it. I had never heard about it until this week. It's called the Los Altos story. It's a documentary from 1989. Do you know anything about this? Okay.
No.
So this is absolutely fascinating. I learned about it because a reporter who's working on a story about this contacted me and wanted me to be sort of the historical perspective in this piece he's working on, and sent me a lot of materials to brush up on, because again, I'd never heard of it. And the Los Altos story is a 30-minute documentary that was made in 1989, which you can watch in full on YouTube, which is what we'll link to. And it is a documentary that the Rotary Club of Los Altos, California. Los Altos is a Silicon Valley suburb, very wealthy, very white, very sort of, historically Republican, especially in 1989. And in 1989, a member of the Rotary Club in Los Altos, his son came home to Los Altos to die of HIV/AIDS. And this man and his family were so impacted, understandably, by the experience that they were having of their beloved son returning to their house to live out his final days. And also this sort of anger they felt that the world around them, like no one seemed to be talking about HIV/AIDS, that it was this distant thing that was happening in faraway places, like even nearby San Francisco, but that was like happening to other people and other types of communities. And, this event radicalized them, as I think it did for many American families at the time, and sort of waking them up to the homophobia of their era and of the country. And it, motivated this family to do something about it. So this man, brought it to his Rotary and said, I want us to be involved in HIV/AIDS. And
Wow.
that was in itself a sort of controversial thing, because the Rotary Club has sort of always prided itself on not doing anything political. And
Yeah.
this was viewed as political, although I think that's sort of an interesting framework, although not surprising for these folks that they would have viewed something like this as political. But anyway, he convinces the club that they are going to devote their resources to AIDS education and helping out some, HIV/AIDS charities. And then what also comes about is this documentary was filmed, and it was filmed by this woman who was a former NBC reporter. And the documentary ended up winning the Peabody Award. It was shown at thousands of Rotary clubs all over the country and in Canada, so it had an impact on millions of people. But it was really this documentary, and I really encourage everyone to watch it, that really altered, I think, public perceptions about like who HIV/AIDS happened to, because all of the video is about sort of the respectability of these folks, right? They're good, tax-paying, job-holding, law-abiding citizens from a, affluent community. And here HIV/AIDS has happened, in one of their own families. And then it turns out, to give a spoiler, that one of the Rotary members a couple of months later also comes forward and says that he had contracted HIV/AIDS through a heart transplant.
Wow.
And so it's just this absolute stunning moment where you see them watching over and over again this like recognition, like, whoa, HIV/AIDS, it can happen right here with people like us. And just watching their sort of dawning recognition of this disease as something different than they perceived it, and then what it motivates them to do. I found it incredibly, I watched it like 7 a.m. in the morning to prepare for this interview, and found myself like getting choked up about it.
Wow.
So cannot encourage people to watch this enough, and just such a fascinating history for me to learn about, that I felt like I should have known, and I didn't. So hopefully this piece will get written and it'll get more attention.
Neil, it's wonderful. And I'm so glad you brought this to us. You know, I've been thinking a lot about AIDS lately because of the conspiracies that
Yeah.
swirled around that, many of which can be attributed to homophobia, but many of which were also a profound ignorance in the American public about how illness worked.
Hmm.
And, you know, even after the HIV virus was isolated and identified, people continued to believe that you could get HIV/AIDS just from walking down the street or from sitting on the wrong toilet. People believed for generations before that that you could get venereal disease from sitting on the toilet. And so the level to which AIDS was really a kind of turning point for activist scientific education. I've been thinking, you know, in the age of Donald Trump, we need to go back to that. We need more citizen groups who are both doing the kind of work you described this this documentary is about, and also devoting themselves, as ACT UP did, to public education campaigns that are incredibly clear about the science behind diseases and vaccines.
Hmm.
So what I want to go viral this week is an article by Daniel Curl in the New York Times at the end of August. It was called Disney and the Decline of America's Middle Class. And it was about a family. It's both interesting in terms of Disney and interesting in terms of what counts as middle class, because this is a family that I might have thought of as working class, a very large family, all of whom had, you know, minimum wage to laboring jobs. And the sort of matriarch of the family, who is disabled, who saved her money for 4 years to take a family, I think of like 9 people, to Disneyland. That was their dream.
Disney
Was
World. I'm going to
Disney
stop you
World,
there
excuse
as an
me,
Orlando native.
Disney World in Florida. And then what Curl talks about is how the Disney World that they imagine is there for them, the sort of fantasy world, the youthful play that everybody can participate in, that the Disney Corporation takes every single opportunity to drain people of their money, that the prices are so horrendous that there is something that in order to avoid waiting in lines for every ride, you have to get up at like 6 o'clock in the morning and make reservations, but you can only make certain kinds of reservations depending on how much you're paying. So if you can't afford to stay on the Disney World proper in their hotel and so on and so forth, you're in a different tier entirely, and you can't make all of those reservations. But what you can do is show up, and like at the last minute, you can pay an extra $20 or $30 per person to jump to the head of the line for the ride. It made Disney World sound like crabs in a barrel, but it also made me think that there is something that we have not yet grasped about how Donald Trump became president, about how these fantasies about the good life are totally focused on people who actually can't afford the good life. And the idea that people are saving their money and then doing these huge blowout vacations at Disney World at the same time as we know that these are the same families that are having difficulty paying for eggs. These are the same families that are going to be taking out student loans to send their kids to community college. And I don't mean that in a moralistic sense, but in a sense of what is it that people don't have as Americans? What great hole are they filling by going to a place that is explicitly ripping them off in a way that I think they would never put up with if the name Disney were not on it. And then the other piece of it is talking about such people as middle class.
Yeah.
When in fact, being middle class has historically meant owning your own home, sending your kids to college, having a car, but, you know, a bunch of material things that are extremely practical. In this case, being middle class means being able to take a blowout vacation and buy souvenirs and immerse yourself in a fantasy world for a few days. I found it an incredibly affecting story. And I was actually kind of curious, Neil, as a Floridian, how you see Disney. I mean, is it as exploitative as it seemed in this article?
Well, and I would say as an Orlandoan, because I,
Yeah.
grew up with Disney in my backyard and have been to Walt Disney World more than 100 times in my life, which is always
Wow.
my icebreaker at events. So I have lots and lots of thoughts about this. I found it so depressing and sad. Um, I think to think of the long history of me going there and like remembering when it was like a $25 ticket and when that felt like, a sort of special event, but still
Right.
totally doable for like the
Right.
average family, and how it just has escalated up from there, and how it's now been hypercharged where like every individual experience at the park comes with its own, buy-in that you have to like add even more money to. It was just so dispiriting to read it. And I can't remember what your question was, but it didn't leave me with really a good feeling about Disney, to know that like they make almost $1 billion alone off of these sort of like the line jumper things
Yeah.
where you
Yeah.
pay extra money just
Yeah.
and I've never once done that. Like, again, having gone more than 100 times, I'd say half of those times we went on free tickets, because
Right.
when you grow up in Orlando, you're always getting tossed off free tickets from church or from school or from whatever, and you just go and you do a ride or two and you don't sweat it. But that's not how
Yeah.
most people
Right.
relate to this park. It's a once in a life event. They spend years raising thousands and thousands of dollars, and I hadn't made the sort of the piece is making lots of, I think, really interesting arguments about sort of the status of the middle class in America
Right.
today. But I think you're really smart to sort of tie it to the swindle that Trump has pulled off with a lot of those same people as well. But it was just a depressing piece, and all the more so since these folks were there in the middle of summer, in
Right.
the most hot,
Right.
awful, terrible time in which you're melting in the humidity, and then you're being overwhelmed by thunderstorms, and climate change is its own experience at Disney as well. But yeah, what a bleak piece. It made me so sad for a place that I've spent so much of my life, and certainly
Right.
think of as tied to like my growing up.
Right. Well, and as I was reading this article, I really wanted something else for these people. And
Yeah.
I read it at the same time as I was working on this piece, which I published on the Substack this week, and it actually got republished in National Memo about Cracker Barrel and why the Cracker Barrel thing was such a big deal. And, part of why it's such a big deal is what they're selling is the Old South, stripped of Jim Crow and slavery and so on. And that is what their gift shop is all about. So all of those people who were so upset at Cracker Barrel being rebranded were actually upset because that's what they want. They want to go and spend their money on Duck Dynasty gear and
Absolutely.
so on. But I thought the Disney thing was a little sadder. I have never wanted to go to Disney. When I was a little kid, I wanted Disney ears, but that was different. I wanted like that hat with the Mickey Mouse ears and so on. But if I ever go to Disney World, you're going with me.
Deal.
Okay. See you next week, Neil.
All right. See you then.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. And you can follow me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Subscribe to Political Junkie Podcast on your favorite platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, image credits, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, or to subscribe for as little as $5 a month. This podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers to Political Junkie. It is written, recorded, edited, and produced by Neil J. Young and me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is My Cousin Eddie by Tony Sopiano. You can find his work on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next time.